The story of the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War is a really interesting story, much of which we just know kind of firsthand. It's really, really recent history. There's a lot more to be written about it, but I remember watching this stuff happen on the news. You should ask your parents about it. They undoubtedly do too, especially after we get to this stuff in the 1980s. But to kind of start this story, I'm going to back up into the 1970s to look at the events that led up to what was really a remarkably swift, nonviolent fall of the Iron Curtain and end of the Cold War. In the 1970s, the premier of the Soviet Union, president of Russia, was a man named Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev was a pretty much a hardline communist. And given the upheavals in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, Brezhnev took a pretty hard line against anti-communist uprisings. And his Brezhnev doctrine essentially insinuated that Russia would restore order in any communist country where it was threatened. And so we were not going to deal patiently with any kind of anti-communist resistance or anti-communist uprisings. He meant business. And consequently, throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, things were generally quiet in the Soviet bloc countries. Things were generally quiet in the 1970s in the Cold War. Historians refer to the 1970s as an era of détente. Détente is a French word meaning thaw, to thaw out, to cool off, etc., or to warm up, excuse me. And so détente refers to this time period where the Cold War wasn't quite so intense. You know, the 1960s were tough with the Cold War, with the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the war in Vietnam, etc. And the 1970s then are a time period of détente, not where the Cold War went away or there wasn't ideological warfare between the Soviet Union and the West, but things warmed up. We can see here American President Richard Nixon on a yacht with Premier Brezhnev, and they're talking and they're enjoying each other. So there was an increased amount of diplomacy and communication between the leaders of the two superpowers. And there were agreements that were never really fulfilled, but there were agreements that were made, like the SALT treaties, Strategic Arm Limitation Treaties, or SALT I and SALT II, both signed during the 1970s. And these were meant to limit, to slow down, to stop the arms race. Now, these never really went through because it was a question of who's going to go first. Well, I'll stop, I'll back off in the arms race, United States, when you do, and no, Russia will back off when you do. But again, here's the idea, here's the agreement, they're bringing the idea to the table that they want to slow things down. I'm going to back off. And so there's just thawing out. There's just warming up of relations between the East and the West. Not to be mistaken with friendship. Not at all. At the end of the 1970s, intensity did come back into the Cold War and resistance began to pick up again. We talked the other day about the election of Karol Wojtyła to the papacy as Pope John Paul II in 1978. He had been a thorn in the side of the communist regime in Poland, not because he openly criticized them, but because he was a fierce advocate of protecting religious freedom and the family and the individual. And these were kind of things that really did threaten communist homogeneity, the communist communal ideal. And we talked about the significance of his mass public mass in Warsaw in 1979, that Karol Wojtyła goes to Poland and the authorities lack the will or the ability to stop him from putting on this huge public display of faith and of religion, of something that they are officially opposed to. And this was a very, very powerful moment. And like I mentioned in class yesterday, many historians look at this as the start of the end of the Cold War, even though it would be a long 10 years across the 1980s until that happened. Pope John Paul II's election and his visit to Poland in 1979 gave rise to a political movement called Solidarity in Poland. And Solidarity was a peaceful political resistance to communism. Solidarity organized around workers, and particularly it organized around shipyard workers from the port city of Danzig. And I'm out of order here, guys, bear with me, but I'll show you a picture there. And their resistance to communism came out of the fact that, like, hey, we're communists, we're the workers, and you know what? You're treating us like crap. They pointed to their bad working conditions. They pointed to their low wages. The Polish communists pointed to the fact that so much of the fruit of their labor went to Russia, that they saw Russia as the primary beneficiary of what they did. And so John Paul II's visit, you know, like I said, it kind of broke fear. It inspired resistance, and this resistance manifested in Poland in the formation of Solidarity, which became a political party. It was an organized workers' resistance to communism. Lech Walesa, the man you see here, is the hero of anti-communist resistance in Poland. He's a very old man now. He's still alive. He's a hero of Polish nationalism, and he was the face of and the leader of the Solidarity movement. And you can see here people marching under the Solidarity banner. Public demonstrations such as this were common. I don't know if you can see in the picture, but the men and the people in the very front of the line, they have their faces and their mouths covered. And this was directly to protest the lack of free speech and the inability of workers in Poland to criticize their situation, to ask for the betterment of their situation. They're in Danzig, if you go back to the Treaty of Versailles, Poland, when it was reformed after World War I, demanded to not be landlocked, surrounded by Germany and the Eastern countries. And so they were given this pathway, this corridor to the Baltic Sea. And Danzig was the port city upon the water. And in the Polish city of Danzig, even down to today, there is a huge shipyard that employed in the second half of the 20th century, and still does, employed thousands and thousands of people. And this was ground zero for Solidarity, because this shipyard was under the direct control of communists and the Russians. And this is where the workers' movement started, where they started to very vocally oppose their treatment. And Solidarity really was given rise to from this. And through the work of Solidarity, the workers at Danzig and elsewhere in Poland were able to achieve some of their demands, not all of their demands, but some of them. And what they wanted was better working conditions, better pay. They wanted things like insurance in the case of accident and injury and death at work. They wanted the ability to complain, to be able to go to somebody and say, hey, this isn't right, or this isn't fair. And you know, they wanted those kind of basic things. And their limited success, and their success was kind of limited, but their limited success just kind of had this edifying effect on Solidarity as a movement and on communist resistance in Poland. In the early 1980s, Leonid Brezhnev died, and he was succeeded by a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev was he was definitely a communist, but he was much more moderate than Brezhnev. And Gorbachev was a really smart guy, and he understood that the whole communist system was in peril. And he didn't take this approach of Brezhnev. Brezhnev was like, you know, if you throw a wiffle ball at me, I'm going to hit you with a sledgehammer. And Gorbachev took a much softer approach. He really understood the world, and he really understood that communism was in jeopardy, that there was serious discontent, and that in many ways the Soviet Union was falling behind the United States in some very important ways. And primarily it was falling behind the United States economically. The U.S. was in the 1980s was quite prosperous, and advancing technologically, and that Russia just really lacked the financial resources to be able to keep up and maintain a pacified citizenry. Well, in the 1980s, the American President Reagan restarted the arms race. He launched a research and development of a system called the Strategic Intercontinental Missile Defense System, and since it was the early 1980s, everyone just called it Star Wars. Spent hundreds of billions of dollars on it. It did not produce any such thing that can fly around in space and shoot down nuclear missiles, but I tell you what, Gorbachev and the Russians had to keep up, and they essentially ended up spending themselves into crisis in the attempt to do that. In order to avert meltdown, Gorbachev instituted two very important reforms that really hastened the end of the Cold War. And I use the word hastened because the handwriting was kind of on the wall. Communism was not going to last in Eastern Europe, not in its present form. And so Glasnost and Perestroika, as these reforms are called, hastened the end. It brought it about faster. And Gorbachev really in Glasnost and Perestroika, even though he did resist this to some extent, he really kind of took on for himself the role of overseeing the collapse of communism. That became his job. So Glasnost and Perestroika, what are they? Glasnost referred to loosening up limitations on the freedom of speech in the Soviet Union. Now, Glasnost is not to be mistaken with freedom of speech. There still was no free speech, but this was, you know, the proverbial inch from which people wanted to take a mile. Glasnost allowed, under some circumstances and in some ways, the right in a limited capacity to criticize the government. You couldn't criticize them too much, and you could only use certain means to do so. But lots and lots of criticism of the communist system poured forth from Glasnost. And Gorbachev did try to put the lid back on that can of worms, because he was like, hey, I didn't even take the lid all the way off, but he took it off enough. And it's really hard to close a Pandora's box. Perhaps more importantly was Perestroika. Perestroika was a loosening up of the economy. It wasn't exactly the same as Lenin's NEP, but Perestroika did allow for some free market style capitalism to flow into Russia. And this was very much designed to increase GDP, economic output, and improve the Russian economy, which was in bad shape. Here's how you need to remember Perestroika. McDonald's, this emblem of the West, right? This emblem of the West. McDonald's opened in Moscow. Ask your parents if they remember this. I remember this being such a big freaking deal in the 1980s when it happened, because McDonald's is a bastion of American culture and capitalism, and it was a big deal that one was going to open in Moscow. And here, y'all, was the most remarkable part. This McDonald's was a wild success. People were so excited about it in Russia. Look at the line of people to get in. This McDonald's, and as they opened in Russia, I don't know how many there are now, and I don't know how many opened under Perestroika, but here's your symbol of this. This McDonald's, people waited in line all day to buy food there. They waited in line all day to buy food there. They were so excited about it. It was so exciting to have choice. What was so great about McDonald's? The choice. Okay, the freedom to choose. College professors and engineers in Moscow quit their jobs to go work at this McDonald's because it had higher wages. It paid higher wages. And just let that sink in for a moment, okay? And you know, this was a big deal. It was a big deal. It showed the great demand, the great desire among the people for these kind of reforms, all right? For these kind of reforms. Seizing the moment in the mid-1980s, as a result of Glasnost and Perestroika, the snowball was starting to roll downhill. Ronald Reagan went to Berlin, and I can't remember exactly what year this was, 1987 maybe, close to the end of his presidency. And Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev actually spoke all the time. They, on a personal level, they had a great relationship. And Reagan really understood what was going on, and he made perhaps, one of the most well-known speeches of his presidency at the Berlin Wall, the Brandenburg Gate. And he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And the applause was heard from around the world. This was just kind of the moment, if you will. Sure enough, in 1989, so it was a couple of years later, in November of 1989, people started to gather in kind of spontaneous demonstrations on both sides of the Berlin Wall. And this went on for about a week. And eventually the police on the eastern side of the wall quit trying to hold the people in. And you can see here people crossing the wall. The gates were open. The borders were open. All of a sudden, between East and West Germany, between East and West Berlin, in 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989, and it came down so fast. It was a really, really remarkable thing. Well, these spontaneous demonstrations that had produced this result, of course, inspired uprisings in all the Soviet bloc countries, and the borders started to open up and people flooded into the streets. I mean, this was just a movement of the masses of people and of the population, and the communist societies everywhere, they capitulated. They capitulated to the people. What's really remarkable about these velvet revolutions, Czechoslovakia's velvet revolution here, which overthrew the communist regime there in 1989, soft resistance, soft peaceful resistance led to this great clamor, and the border between Czechoslovakia and Austria was opened, and the communist regime fell. They call it the Velvet Revolution. Think about what velvet. Velvet is soft and it's nice, and this is the perfect, these were joyful moments. They weren't without hardship, but they were without violence. Václav Havel was the leader, the figurehead of Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution. And he was a very prominent writer and a very prominent advocate of free speech and free ideas and reform. He had been an instrumental figure in the Prague Spring of 1968, and he was elected the first president of a democratic Czechoslovakia. In 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev withdrew Russia from the Soviet Union. And this was really the end of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain was essentially down, and when Gorbachev withdrew Russia from the Soviet Union, there was nothing left, right? Think about that's like what's going to hold up all the branches of the trees if the trunk's gone. So he withdrew them, and now he is kind of overseeing the end of the Cold War, the transition of Russia to a democracy, which in 1991 elected this man, Boris Yeltsin, as its first democratically elected president. This did not all go down easily. There was a really carefully staged coup that did produce some violence. This happened in the city of Moscow after Gorbachev had withdrawn Russia from the Soviet Union. Some hardline communists did try to re-establish control of the government there, but they failed. In Romania, the communist dictator, Mr. Ceausescu, he and his wife were captured by the people and were executed. Mr. and Mrs. Ceausescu had been some of the most violent and terrible communist dictators in any of the Eastern Bloc countries. And so the Cold War was coming to an end a little bit more violently in the Balkans than in other regions. When General Tito died in the late 80s in Yugoslavia, he was replaced by this guy, Slobodan Milosevic, who was Serbian and who started to essentially break apart Yugoslavia as it had been known. And while the revolutions and the end of the Cold War between Eastern and Western Europe, the collapse of the Iron Curtain had been largely peaceful, this was not the reality in Yugoslavia. Milosevic started he was a Serbian, and he started a program of ethnic cleansing, and you can imagine genocide against Bosnians, Muslims, and other groups he considered non-Balkan, non-European. And in the early 1990s, this produced a very, very bloody civil war in the Balkan nations of the former Yugoslavia. And this was a war that was terrible and went to the civilians in very, very real ways. They are still uncovering mass graves there. It was a terrible, terrible moment. And so at the end of that, Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, was broken into numerous independent countries. And where Tito could keep peace between the different religious and ethnic groups, the breakup of the Soviet Union brought all of that tension to the forefront. And there was a great deal of violence as a consequence, from which they still really have not recovered. We will end with this. I really like this little cartoon, the Cold War Corpse comics. This is Reagan and John Paul II and Gorbachev meeting in heaven, having a conversation about who was the most important figure in ending the Cold War. A great argument to be made for all three of them having a very powerful impact on that. And Reagan and John Paul II have both died, but Mikhail Gorbachev, like I said, he's still alive. So, and they said that's coming up soon.